In the hedgerows of Normandy, a German sniper sees the rounded top of an American M1 helmet rise above a bank of earth. It comes up slowly, not in a jerk, not like a trick, like a tired infantryman lifting his head just high enough to look over the next field. The sniper waits until the shape is clear, settles his rifle and fires. The helmet disappears, but no man falls with it. No medic moves, no squad crawls forward, no one shouts. Instead, somewhere behind the American hedge, an observer who never exposed his own head has been watching the German side through a periscope. He has been waiting for one thing only, the brief evidence that a rifle has fired from a place that had been almost impossible to see. A flicker, leaves moving where there should have been no movement, perhaps a trace of smoke or disturbed dust. The American in the helmet was never there. The real target was the shot. That difference changed the problem. A sniper expects to fight men. He expects to decide when to fire, whom to fire at, and when to move. The danger of the sniper is that he controls the first visible act. He hides while the other side must cross open ground, raise a head signal, carry a radio, lead a patrol, or drag a wounded man. In Normandy in the summer of 1944, that control could paralyze an American squad. The Bocage was built for ambush. Fields were divided by thick hedgerows growing from banks of packed earth. Sunken lanes cut between them. From one field, the next might be only a short distance away and still be hidden completely. A rifleman could be close enough to hear voices on the other side of a hedge and still have no clean view of the man he wanted to kill. For an attacking unit, this created a brutal kind of uncertainty. A squad could reach one hedgerow, prepare to cross a gap, and lose a man to a single shot from somewhere ahead. Everyone went flat. The next few seconds mattered. If the sniper could not be located, the men on the ground had to assume that every tree, every dark opening, every fold in the bank might contain him. The sniper did not need to kill the whole squad. He only needed to make movement feel suicidal. German training made that effect stronger. The source describes a 1943 German sniper training pamphlet that emphasized patience, terrain study, target selection, concealment, and escape. The ideal sniper was not supposed to shoot at every movement. He was supposed to wait for a target whose loss mattered. An officer, a radio operator, a leader, a man exposing himself long enough to make the shot worthwhile. The logic was sound. Every shot carried a cost. A bullet leaving the rifle did more than travel toward the target. It created sound, flash, movement, and a moment of attention. A sniper who fired too often gave the enemy more chances to find him. So discipline meant surviving long enough to fire again. The source uses Matthias Hetzenauer as an extreme example of what that culture of patience could produce. Hetzenauer was an Austrian mountain soldier who fought on the Eastern Front, not in Normandy, and the source credits him with hundreds of confirmed kills. His career should not be used as a stand-in for every German sniper, but it helps explain the ideal the training system admired. Careful observation, long waits, range judgment, concealment, and a refusal to spend a shot casually. The important part for Normandy is not the legend of one marksman. It is the behavior that the legend rewarded. A sniper who remained still for hours could watch the same gap until he understood who crossed it, how often, and why. He could learn which soldier carried a radio. He could notice who gave hand signals. He could wait while ordinary riflemen passed and fire only when the loss might slow the unit behind them. In broken terrain, that selectivity could magnify the psychological effect of a single rifle. An attacking infantryman rarely knew what the sniper knew. The sniper had chosen his position. The infantryman had to reveal his route. The sniper had time to study a narrow piece of ground. The infantryman might be seeing that ground for the first time. The sniper could decide not to fire. The infantryman still had to move. That asymmetry mattered more than pure marksmanship. A scoped rifle was dangerous, but a scoped rifle hidden in terrain that forced the enemy to expose himself on schedule was far more dangerous. The source includes a wartime American account in which a squad advancing from one hedgerow to another was stopped after a man was hit by a sniper. Once the men dropped, the shooter continued to exploit the same patch of ground. The details in such combat accounts vary, but the tactical problem is clear. If the squad could not determine where the fire was coming from, every attempt to help the wounded, shift position, or resume the advance risked creating another target. This is the failure point that makes the later adaptation meaningful. The first answer to a sniper is often instinctive. Look harder, search the windows, search the trees, search the opposite bank. Put a marksman on the suspected area and hope he sees the enemy first. But in the Bocage, looking harder could simply expose more heads. The terrain had already been shaped into concealment. A sniper could fire from behind foliage, from a recessed position, from a building edge, or from a point with a covered route away. Even if several men stared at the right hedge, they might see nothing while the rifle remained silent. The Americans needed a method that did not depend on winning a staring contest. And that is the moment when the problem changes from vision to behavior. If the enemy cannot be seen while he is still, create a reason for him to move, fire, or otherwise disturb the scene. That is a different kind of counter-sniping. It treats the sniper not only as a target, but as a system with a trigger condition. What will make him act? What does he consider worth a shot? What does he expect an exposed American to look like? Once those questions become part of the hunt, his own discipline becomes observable. That discipline is part of what made German snipers so dangerous. It is also why the American counter became more interesting than a simple shooting contest. The United States Army in the Second World War did not field a sniper system identical to the German one described in the source. American units had scoped rifles and experienced marksmen, but the infantry company possessed something else that could matter more once a hidden shooter had been located: observers, radios, automatic weapons, and mortars. The Americans did not always need to put a better sniper behind another rifle. They needed to make the hidden rifle reveal where it was. That is where the helmet came in. An M1 helmet was one of the most recognizable American shapes on the battlefield. From the front or side, even at distance, its rounded steel shell and brim could announce an American soldier before a face or uniform was clearly visible. A sniper watching a hedgeline naturally searched for exactly that kind of shape. An infantryman could exploit the habit without putting his skull inside the helmet. A helmet could be lifted on a stick, on a rifle, or on another support from behind cover. The movement mattered. If it snapped into view and vanished at once, it looked suspicious. If it rose slowly, paused, and seemed to test the ground ahead, it could resemble the beginning of a real exposure. The man holding it stayed below the bank. Another man watched somewhere else. That second man was the important part. The decoy by itself did nothing except invite a bullet. The technique became dangerous to the sniper only when the decoy was part of an observation system. The helmet created a question the sniper had to answer. The observer watched for the answer. If the sniper refused to fire, the Americans lost nothing but time. If he fired, he risked surrendering the one thing he had spent hours protecting: uncertainty about his position. The source describes American observers using periscopes from cover so they could study the opposing hedgerow without showing their own heads. In the brief instant after the sniper fired, the observer might catch a small disturbance that had been invisible before. The exact evidence could vary with distance, light, foliage, and position. The point was not that every shot produced a perfect glowing marker. The point was that a concealed firing position was easier to notice at the moment it fired than while it remained silent. Once a likely location was identified, the fight no longer belonged entirely to the sniper. A squad could suppress that patch of ground. A patrol could maneuver on it. A mortar team could be called. The method depended on the unit, the terrain, and what support was available, but the equation had changed. Before the shot, the German sniper was a hidden man searching for visible Americans. After the shot, he could become a visible problem for an entire American unit. This was not a magical transformation. It did not mean every helmet decoy produced a dead sniper. A muzzle flash could be masked. Leaves could conceal movement. Combat noise could make the direction of a shot difficult to judge. A skilled sniper who fired from deep shadow, used a covered route, or moved immediately could still escape. And a squad that treated the trick as proof rather than as a clue could send fire into the wrong place. But the Americans did not need certainty every time. They needed a way to reduce uncertainty enough to move again. That was the practical value of the decoy. It turned a passive problem into an active test. Instead of waiting for a real man to be hit and then trying to reconstruct where the bullet came from, a unit could create a false opportunity while its observers were already prepared. The sniper was asked to reveal himself at a moment chosen by the men hunting him. The technique was older than Normandy. During the First World War, Major Hesketh Pritchard developed British counter-sniping methods on the Western Front. The source describes one of those methods as a dummy head, made to resemble a soldier peering above a trench. When an enemy sniper fired through it, the bullet holes could help observers estimate the line from which the shot had come. The details were different, but the principle was the same. A false target could force a real weapon to declare itself. That idea survived because it did not depend on a particular rifle. It depended on something more basic. The shooter had to act before the observer could learn anything new. The same principle appears in the source's account of Stalingrad. Vasily Zaitsev wrote about hunting a German sniper with a spotter in the ruined city. In the episode described by the source, a helmet was used as a decoy to provoke a shot. Whether read as memoir, Fieldcraft, or a later famous counter-sniper story, the logic is recognizable. The decoy was valuable not because it resembled a soldier perfectly. It was valuable because it attempted to control when the hidden shooter would expose evidence of his position. By the time Americans were fighting in Italy and then France, they did not need to rediscover the physics. What changed was the battlefield network around the trick. Italy was an important classroom because the terrain repeatedly pushed American units into the kind of close, obstructed fighting in which a hidden marksman could stop movement out of proportion to his numbers. Mountain roads, stone buildings, shattered villages, and prepared German positions offered places where a rifleman could observe an approach without presenting much of himself. Veterans learned that the first object entering a suspicious opening did not have to contain a man. A helmet on a rifle could appear above rubble before a head did. A hat could be moved near a window. A shape could be shown where a soldier would normally have to look. The point was not theatrical deception. The point was to risk an object before risking a body. That lesson carried naturally into France. The Normandy hedgerows made the decoy especially useful because they created so many edges. Every field boundary was a place where a man eventually had to peek, climb, cut, crawl, or cross. The same terrain that helped the German sniper predict American exposure also gave Americans many believable places from which to present a false exposure. A good decoy did not need to fool the entire German line. It needed to attract the attention of one watcher already committed to a narrow sector. Imagine the sequence from the American side. A squad reaches a hedgerow and stops because a rifle has already fired from somewhere beyond the next field. The men know the general direction but not the position. One soldier stays low and works a helmet onto the end of a support. Another shifts farther down the hedge with a periscope or a protected view. A third is ready to pass a location to the men who can suppress it. The helmet comes up. Nothing happens. It drops. They try again from a slightly different place or at a different pace. Still nothing. That does not prove safety. The sniper may have moved, he may see the trick, he may simply be waiting. The squad is still dealing in probabilities. Then the helmet rises a third time and a rifle cracks. The difference is that now the Americans are not surprised by the shot. They created the moment for it. Eyes are already on the suspected line. The men who will react are already prepared to react. That preparation compresses time. In a normal ambush, the sniper fires first and the target's side begins solving the problem only after a casualty. There is confusion. Men seek cover. Someone tries to determine who was hit. Someone else tries to find the shooter, and seconds or minutes disappear. With a decoy, the first bullet can arrive into a plan that already exists. The observers do not have to decide what the shot means. They were waiting for exactly that event. This is where American supporting weapons become central to the story. The source describes 60mm mortars being used against suspected sniper positions once observers had a usable location. That should not be read as a promise that every company could drop rounds onto every muzzle flash within a fixed number of seconds. Combat did not work that cleanly. Communications failed. Terrain interfered. Mortar crews had other tasks. Coordinates could be wrong. The sniper could move. But the possibility itself changed the risk. A German sniper who fired at a real officer expected the potential reward to justify exposing his position. A German sniper who fired at an empty helmet could pay the same exposure cost for no human result at all. And if the American unit had mortars, machine guns, or maneuvering infantry ready to exploit the clue, the cost could become severe very quickly. This makes the trick less about fooling eyesight and more about manipulating the sniper's risk calculation. The decoy offered a target that looked valuable enough to justify a shot while actually being almost worthless to lose. That exchange was asymmetric. The American side risked steel, the sniper risked position. Position was the more valuable asset. The same principle explains why field versions did not have to be standardized. In a city, the bait might appear at a broken window. In wooded terrain, it might be a helmet or dummy shape visible between trunks. In a trench or foxhole, it might rise just high enough to suggest a man checking the ground. The object changed because the environment changed. The logic remained stable. That is a sign of a useful battlefield idea. It survives when the prop changes. A First World War sniper team might use geometry, observation, and another rifle to answer a shot. An American infantry unit in 1944 could sometimes answer with the weapons already woven into the company and battalion around it. That mattered in Normandy because the terrain compressed the problem. The hedgerows did not offer the long, clean sight lines of a rifle range. They created short corridors, blocked views, and sudden openings. A German sniper could hold a lane or a gap and force attackers to crawl. wait, detour, or expose themselves one at a time. A single concealed shooter did not have to dominate miles of front. He only had to make one necessary crossing too dangerous to attempt. The American response, therefore, did not require a grand technological breakthrough. It required coordination at a small scale. One man presented the false target, one man watched. Someone identified the likely firing point. Then the squad, platoon, or supporting weapons acted on that information. This is why the helmet on a stick is easy to underestimate when it appears in a photograph. It looks childish, almost comic. A steel pot on the end of a rifle or a branch does not resemble the sophisticated equipment normally associated with counter-sniper warfare. But the object is not the system. The system is the relationship between the decoy, the hidden observer, and the force waiting behind them. The helmet is only the switch. That also explains why German sniper discipline could become vulnerable without becoming bad doctrine. It is tempting to say the Germans were defeated because they were too rigid, or because their training somehow taught them to shoot at anything shaped like a helmet. The source goes further in that direction, but the more cautious conclusion is narrower. Good sniper training demands discrimination. The shooter must decide whether what he sees is a real target worth the risk of firing. That creates a decision rule. Any decision rule can be tested if the enemy learns what evidence the shooter considers convincing. The American M1 helmet was useful because it supplied one of those pieces of evidence. It was recognizably American. It appeared where an American head might appear, and when raised carefully, it could remain in view long enough to tempt a shooter who had been trained not to waste ammunition on meaningless flickers of movement. The better the decoy matched the sniper's expectations, the less it needed to look like a complete human being. At several hundred yards, no one needed to sculpt a face. The sniper was not identifying a person. He was identifying a battlefield category. American soldier exposing his head. That distinction made the helmet efficient. It also made the technique cheap enough to spread without a formal program. The source describes the method moving through field experience rather than through a single official wartime American sniper school. Men saw it work. They repeated it. Variants appeared with helmets, hats, dummy figures, and other pieces of equipment. The underlying procedure could be passed from veteran to replacement in a few sentences. Do not raise your head. Raise something else. Have someone watching when the shot comes. Those instructions sound almost too simple to belong beside the elaborate training of a specialist marksman. But that simplicity was a strength. The technique required no rare weapon, no precision optic, and no long course of instruction. It used equipment already present and habits infantrymen already understood. Stay behind cover, observe, communicate, bring available fire onto a threat. One of the source's most useful examples comes not from a famous sniper, but from a Canadian veteran identified as Mr. Parsons in a later oral history. He described a group dealing with a German sniper by using a hat and rope to create the impression of movement in a tree. The exact setup differed from the M1 helmet over a hedgerow, but the logic remained the same. Give the sniper a plausible reason to fire. Watch for where the shot comes from. That matters because it shows how the idea escaped specialist ownership. Once a method can be understood by infantrymen, drivers, observers, and support troops, it stops being a trick that belongs to one expert. It becomes fieldcraft. And fieldcraft spreads differently from doctrine. Doctrine is written, standardized, taught, inspected, and revised. Fieldcraft can move sideways through an army in a night. One squad watches another solve a problem. A sergeant remembers it. A replacement asks why a helmet has a hole through it. The answer becomes a lesson. No committee is required. That does not make fieldcraft superior to doctrine. Armies need doctrine because large organizations cannot operate on improvisation alone. The point is that the two solve different problems. Doctrine prepares soldiers for recurring situations. Fieldcraft adapts when the enemy finds a way to exploit the prepared answer. In the Bocage, both sides were doing this constantly. German defenders used terrain, camouflage, patient observation, and carefully chosen shots. American attackers learned to cut through hedges, alter movement, coordinate tanks and infantry more closely, and find local ways to reduce the advantages of defenders who already knew the ground. The helmet decoy belongs to that larger pattern of adaptation. It was not a wonder weapon. It was a way to ask the battlefield a better question. Not can we see the sniper, but can we make the sniper do something visible? The difference is small in language and enormous in practice. A hidden sniper is dangerous because silence protects him. Every second he waits, he forces other men to expose themselves before he does. The decoy tries to reverse that sequence. It offers him the appearance of an exposed man while keeping the real men protected. If he accepts the offer, he acts first. For a moment, the hunter becomes the source of information. That is why the next weapon did not have to be a sniper rifle. The source describes mortar fire being used against suspected positions after the shot was located. In other cases, the response could be machine gun fire, rifle fire, or maneuver. The exact answer depended on what the unit had and how good the observation was. The important fact is organizational. The American infantryman holding the helmet did not have to defeat the German sniper by himself. He only had to connect the sniper to the rest of the unit. This is the part of the story that disappears when the episode is told as a duel between cleverness and marksmanship. The helmet was not a better weapon than a scoped Mauser. It was barely a weapon at all. Its value came from turning the sniper's shot into a message that other weapons could use. That kind of thinking appears throughout modern war. A visible action is often valuable not only for what it does directly, but for what it reveals. A gun flashes, a radio transmits, a vehicle moves, a position resupplies. Each act can solve one problem while creating information for the enemy. Snipers understood this better than most soldiers because concealment was their protection. German training, as described in the source, emphasized leaving a position after firing, or at least having a concealed way out. That was not superstition. It recognized that a shot changes the status of a hiding place. Before the shot, it is only one possible position among many. After the shot, it may be one of very few. The helmet decoy was a way of spending that change on an object instead of a man. The price of the information was a piece of steel getting hit, or even simply drawing fire nearby. That was a favorable exchange if it let the squad move again. There were limits. A patient sniper who suspected a decoy could ignore it. A shooter might fire from a secondary position and move before a response arrived. Dense forest could shorten lines of sight so much that observers saw very little. Ruined towns created multiple windows, broken walls, and deep shadows that made a firing point hard to isolate. Artillery and small arms noise could obscure the origin of a single rifle shot, and the method carried its own danger. Success could make men careless. A helmet that drew no fire did not prove a road, hedge, or building was safe. Silence could mean there was no sniper. It could also mean the sniper had decided not to answer. That limitation is important because it keeps the technique in its proper scale. The decoy did not make German snipers obsolete. It gave infantrymen one way to contest the initiative. And the most important result was often not a body count. A sniper's operational effect was measured in delay as much as in casualties. If one rifle forced a platoon to stop at a road, prevented a runner from crossing a lane, or kept an observer from reaching a useful position, the sniper was succeeding even before another man was hit. The countermeasure, therefore, did not have to end with a confirmed kill to be useful. If a decoy forced the shooter to relocate, the lane might open for a few minutes. If suppression kept him from observing, a squad might cross the gap he had been controlling. If the shot allowed the Americans to identify one dangerous building among several, the next movement could be planned around that knowledge. This is a different measure of payoff from the one found in sniper scorekeeping. The sniper counted targets. The infantry unit counted whether it could move. That difference helps explain why a crude decoy could matter without ever becoming a celebrated weapon. It solved a local problem long enough for a larger action to continue. In the scale of a campaign, such moments disappear into reports as movement resumed, resistance reduced, or a position bypassed. On the ground, however, the difference between being pinned and being able to cross one opening could decide who reached the next hedge, house, or road junction first. The decoy's second-order effect was therefore tempo. It could return a small piece of time to the attacking unit by forcing the hidden shooter to spend his concealment sooner than he intended. In ruins, forests, and hedgerows later in the campaign, variations of the same principle could still appear. A helmet might go through a broken window before a head did. A dummy shape might be placed where a real soldier would be visible. A piece of equipment could be moved while observers watched for reaction. The specific object mattered less than the sequence. False exposure, real observation, enemy reaction, then response. That sequence is why the trick survived long after the M1 helmet and the Carabiner 98K stopped facing each other in France. Later armies kept using decoys because the underlying human problem remained. A hidden shooter must balance two needs that can never be perfectly reconciled. He must remain concealed and he must eventually act. If he never acts, he cannot affect the fight. If he acts, he risks revealing information. The defender tries to choose the safest moment. The attacker tries to manufacture a moment that only looks safe. The helmet is one of the simplest ways to do that. For the German sniper in Normandy, the trap was especially sharp because his strengths were real. He had patience. He understood concealment. He knew that careless firing was dangerous. He was trained to wait for a target worth the risk. The American answer did not erase those strengths. It changed what counted as a target. A familiar steel shape could be made to satisfy enough of the sniper's expectations to invite a shot. And once the shot came, the sniper had entered a contest larger than marksmanship. He was now dealing with observers, communications, squad movement, and supporting fire. The duel had become a network. That is a more useful way to understand the helmet decoy than as a story of one army being clever and the other being foolish. The German shooter was not fooled because he lacked training. He could be fooled because battlefield identification is always made from incomplete information. Distance hides detail. Vegetation breaks outlines. Time pressure narrows judgment. And a soldier cannot inspect a target indefinitely without losing the chance to act. The Americans exploited that uncertainty with an object whose loss did not matter. There is also a deeper contrast in what each side was trying to preserve. The sniper preserved position. The infantry squad preserved movement. For the sniper, remaining unseen kept him alive and dangerous. For the squad, remaining pinned meant the mission stopped. The helmet decoy traded a cheap object for a chance to restore movement. Even when it failed to locate the shooter precisely, it could force him to hesitate, move, or reveal that he was watching a particular lane. That was enough to change behavior. And changing behavior is often more useful than winning a perfect kill. The source tells the story as a clash between disciplined German doctrine and flexible American improvisation. There is truth in the contrast, but the most durable mechanism sits one level lower. The decisive advantage did not come from being less doctrinal. It came from changing the information problem. As long as the Americans asked, "Where is the sniper?" they were searching a landscape designed to hide him. The decoy asked a different question. What will make him tell us? That shift is why an empty helmet could matter more than another rifle scope. Return to the hedgerow. The helmet rises. A German rifle cracks. The steel shell jerks and drops behind the bank. For a fraction of a second, the shooter has every reason to think the engagement has gone his way. He saw an American shape. He fired first. He remains hidden from the men he intended to kill. But the American side is not looking at the helmet. It is looking past it, at the leaves that moved, at the dark gap that flashed, at the patch of ground that was only a possibility a second earlier, and is now a place worth watching, suppressing, or striking. No soldier falls with the helmet. Somewhere behind the hedge, a man with a periscope has already seen enough.